Good morning, Ollie members, and welcome to Fall for the Book, The Price of Exclusion. We have an insightful program for you folks, but before we get started, we request that you stay muted to reduce background noise. The chat will be available to you at any time to send in questions, and we highly encourage questions. However, we will be holding all questions for the conclusion of the lecture. Please note this class is being recorded and uploaded to our Ollie Lecture Library. Ollie Mason is a 501c3 nonprofit organization affiliated with George Mason University and the National Osher Lifelong Learning Network. We provide classes, lectures, trips, clubs, social, and other activities for over 1,000 active learners age 50 plus. Over 500 college-level courses covering a broad range of subjects are offered each year. Programs are presented in person at the Fairfax campus, at satellite sites throughout Fairfax County, and of course, online. If you enjoy this program, we encourage you to become a member of Ollie Mason so you can register for our upcoming classes and events. You can learn more about Ollie Mason by visiting our website, ollie.gmu.edu, which I will add to the chat section. Thank you so much, Nicole and Lenitra, for being here, and thank you so much, Susie. Take it away.
Thanks, Madison, and thank you to Ollie Mason for partnering with Fall for the Book on this program. My name is Susie Rigdon, and I'm the festival manager. As you all may know, Fall for the Book hosts year-round programming in person and online. Our 2026 festival runs from October 6th to 10th, and you can find out more information about it at fallforthebook.org. On the bottom of every page on our website, you'll also find a newsletter sign-up form if you'd like to stay up to date on our latest announcements. Fall for the Book is a literary arts nonprofit that depends on the support of sponsors and individual donors. Please consider becoming a friend of the festival to help us to continue to present fantastic programs like this one. Visit fallforthebook.org/friends to get started. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Lenitra M. Berger is an associate professor of history and art history and director of African and African American studies at George Mason University. She's an award-winning scholar, educator, and social justice advocate working towards making higher education accessible to low-income, first-generation, and minority students. Her scholarly interests are in art and social activism in the African and Jewish diasporas. For over 15 years, her work as an educator has focused on creating and expanding education abroad opportunities for underrepresented students, particularly in international education. As a social justice advocate, she supports student activism through her teaching, advising, public speaking, and research. Now I'll turn it over to you, Lenitra.
Thank you so much, Susie, for that introduction, and thank you to Madison for facilitating this wonderful conversation today. We are in for such a treat to have this conversation with Nicole Carr, who I'm pleased to introduce and excited to have a conversation with. Before I get started, though, this is your conversation, participants, and so I want you to make sure that you put your questions and answers in the chat so that we can have a robust conversation. And so with that, I am thrilled to introduce Nicole Carr, who is an award-winning journalist, professor, and speaker based in Atlanta, Georgia. Her work has explored the intersections of race, politics, education, and democracy. Nicole's reporting and analysis have appeared in numerous national and local outlets, including ProPublica, PBS Frontline, CNN, the Brooklyn Public Library's Borrowed and Banned podcast, The Emancipator, The Griot, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, various television stations and networks, and public media across the country. She is a 4-time Emmy award-winning journalist. Her long-form narrative investigation into the anti-DEI movement earned a 2023 Sidney Award, and her essay commentary on the democratizing force of the historic Black press won a 2025 award in op-ed from the American Society of Authors and Editors. Carr teaches journalism at Morehouse College, where she's developed courses in history of the Black press, social justice journalism, and investigative reporting. I really wish I could take all of those classes. She's co-led students on international trips, which I can't wait to discuss, where they've reported on matters of the Black diaspora from Belize and Panama. So we're here today to talk about her current book that was just published this month. Congratulations. The Price of Exclusion, The Pursuit of Healthcare in a Segregated Nation, published by HarperCollins Day in June of 2026. And this book is part ancestral journey and part historical reparation. It relies heavily on untouched archives and pages of the historic Black press to explore racism, medical education, and the plight of Black physicians in America and abroad. And Publishers Weekly recently called it, quote, an eye-opening revelation of systemic racism in American medical training and a moving celebration of the Black doctors who persisted, end quote. Nicole is a proud graduate of Winston-Salem State University, which is a historically Black college, and Syracuse University. And she's currently a PhD student in the humanities at Clark Atlanta University, also an HBCU, where she's focused on African American studies. She lives in Georgia with her husband and 3 children. So I want to, first of all, encourage everyone, if you have not bought this book, to do so now, but also to welcome Nicole to the conversation. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Lenitra. I'm very, very happy to be with you this morning. Thank you, everyone, for being with us.
Thanks, Nicole. First of all, I have to say that this book is such a needed text that we all need to read to understand the complete history of the medical system and healthcare in the United States, but it's also very beautifully written. So I really could just, I couldn't put it down. I found myself just reading and reading, and before I knew it, an hour had passed by, which is hard for us to do in a fragmented social media age. So that's saying a lot for your ability to tell a story. And that leads me to my first question for you, which is how did you decide to write the book the way you did? It's part history and analysis and part personal story.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm getting a little emotional when I start talking about this. I think this is the 5th talk this week. And I always tell people I never planned to write a book. We were at the height of the COVID pandemic, or the early months, that springtime, March to April. And I was working in local television, and I was 4 months postpartum with our 3rd child, our pandemic baby. And our 2 daughters were in virtual school, kindergarten and 3rd grade. My husband works in media too, and so we had this makeshift studio in the garage, and he was running my live shots. And I came off the 11 o'clock news one evening, pretty depressed by what we were reporting on. And I asked myself, how did they get through this 100 years ago? And I knew that we had an ancestor, my great-grandfather, who was a physician, born 1893. He says he was born in 1898, but he was born in 1893, colonial Jamaica. And I knew he'd gone to Howard University's School of Medicine. But we didn't know a whole lot about this ancestor because of family relationships. His son, the doctor's son, was my grandmother's first husband, my father's biological father, but they were in an abusive relationship. And so my grandmother essentially had to leave her children in Jamaica to be reared while she came to the United States, and she met the grandfather that I know. And so we carried a name, but didn't speak much of the people. We didn't speak of the name we carried. And so I started peeling back the onion. The Mellon Foundation had just given Howard University money to digitize some new assets out of Moreland Spingarn. And I started looking for him because I had a full name from a photo that a cousin had given me some years ago. So I'm just up at night, just snooping. And it just so happens that one of the new assets at Howard is his medical school yearbook. It's the morgue. That's what they call it, the morgue, 1925. And so I find him and see his young face for the first time and learn all the things that you'll read about in the book about his service in the Great War for the Crown once The king called for colored troops to volunteer because they were banned at one time. The battles they went through in the Great War, the land reparations that did not come to be once they came back ashore and came home. Him landing in America during Red Summer and all. And so I start going down a rabbit hole, and I'm telling my agent at the time, who's working in TV, I'm just on the phone, like, you won't believe what I found. And I'm calling my dad, and she goes, you should write a book. And I was like, really? I don't. And so it started with that idea. And so I went down a few more rabbit holes. And then I said, you know what? I could really use his story to drive us through this century of histories. And I was seeing the same thing, like pandemic, racial reckoning, access to education, and merit versus intelligence. I'm looking at the language economy in the archives. And so I just use him as a guide, and I would really say a spiritual guide. And I wrote the only way I know how to write, which is in a narrative form. I see before I, coming out of television, I see and I hear first, like my brain works in that way. And so I try to write the way that I write for television, but in full sentences. So, yeah, so that's how it started, and that's how I decided to write it in this way and to really bring people to life. It's one thing to say these things happened and these policies existed, but to kind of take you into sometimes into someone's childhood and their path to the hospital and the things that they were feeling and seeing at the time. I just wanted to bring people to life.
I love that idea and how you described him as a spiritual guide. I know what it's like to write a book about a person. I wrote about a Jewish South African artist, and I basically felt like I lived with her for my entire adult life. And so I'm wondering, what did you learn in walking the path with him for so long? What did you learn about him and about yourself?
Oh man, I really learned about my father. My father is a retired Army colonel who I'm actually sitting in his office now. I'm joining you all from Texas because we have a talk in San Antonio tomorrow night. My dad, we used to joke that they were going to have to strap him up and pull him out of the Army, like that he would never retire. And he had a bout with prostate cancer as he got closer to his 30th year and kind of forced his retirement. And he was in special operations units. And I can remember the first time my brother and I really understood what he did for a living. Like, we knew he was in the military. We knew we moved every year or every 2 years. We moved 10 times before I was 16. We knew the Army, but when he took off for Mogadishu in the early 90s for the Battle of Mogadishu and what Hollywood brought to life in Black Hawk Down, that's when we realized what he did. And when I started learning about my great-grandfather, Dr. Lawrence St. Clair Ferguson, and I learned that he was in that unit, the British West Indies unit, British West Indies Regiment unit that froze at Halifax. So their ship was rerouted at the beginning of the war. And the British had not given them the proper clothing to survive cold weather. Most of these men had never left the island. And if they'd had time in service or at sea or far from the island, they were coming from the Panama Canal Zone and building the canal. But most of these young volunteers had never left home. And they run into this blizzard at Halifax, and most of the unit, either they die or their limbs are amputated. He survives, and he goes on. There's a holding hospital in Bermuda, and they fix him up real quick, and they go on with the war. And then there's an uprising at the end of the war from the West Indian troops who in Italy who want their proper pay. And they've got the mutiny. And so they come back shamed, and they say, you're not honorable when they come back. And so they don't get these land reparations. But I'm reading the war diaries because I can find in the British archives, his unit, his commander has great records. There are troops who wrote letters that were published in the Jamaica Gleaner, albeit months later, that would tell you the conditions of war. And I began thinking about the things that I know my dad went through in service. And there's still a lot that I don't know. But I was like, where does that kind of drive come from, that strength that makes you want to do this? Because these are volunteer services. What makes you want to do this? What makes you want to forge ahead? And then I saw his interest in the arts. And, at one point I find him with Zora Neale Hurston at a gala when she's on the Guggenheim Fellowship, before she leaves for Haiti. And, nobody really believes in her work at this time. And this is right before she writes Their Eyes Were Watching God. And he's speaking about the brilliance of her, decades, eons before we're calling her prolific, because it takes Alice Walker to dust off the grave and resurrect this work. And I'm looking at the way they traveled and how he leaves America at some point, I'm guessing because of policy. I don't have diary entries. I'm in the book, I'm telling you the conditions. And then when he leaves for Scotland to train and then take over the hospitals, I'm just fascinated by him. But then I see bits of my father in this. And I'm telling my father these things. And I was like, that's why you're the way you are. That's why you do this. And so we begin to bond over this. And I become, I get to teach him. And I get to be this kind of griot for the family. And I'm like, man, had we known some of this stuff earlier, what would I be today if I'd known of this? Would I have different interests? Could I have seen myself in a space where we barely exist, but I know somebody from this time who's along my bloodline does that? It makes you feel good. It makes you feel confident, and also angry at the kind of the secrets that we keep and what it takes to unearth these things. So I know that was long-winded, but for me, it was a gift to my father. And I'm ecstatic that this came out the week of Father's Day. It was supposed to come out like a couple of years ago. And then in March, but it came out at the right time. And it's truly a gift. It's a gift to the family. So
Yeah, it's so funny how you have an idea of when you want your book to come out, but the book comes out when it's supposed to, not a day before or a day after. And I want to say that the book is as much a military history as it is a history of medical education and healthcare. So I really like the way you go into that part of the story. Because a little bit later, I do have some questions about healthcare, from the military perspective.
Yeah.
But I want to zero in on one thing that you mentioned about your Dr. St. Clair Ferguson having to go to Scotland for education. So I'm an international educator, and I firmly believe that it's important for minority students to study abroad. And
Yes.
one of the misconceptions is that study abroad is not for minority students. It's for white, wealthy, privileged kids. When in fact, we were the ones who had to go overseas first
Oh, yeah.
to get an education. And so that's a recurring theme throughout your book, is that Black people had to leave the United States early on to get a medical education. So could you talk about that aspect of the early years of Black people getting medical education?
Yeah, I think, one thing that I wanted to set the record straight with someone, I don't know, I was online somewhere and people were talking about the burst of West Indian students at Howard University in the 50s, right? I found my great grandfather in the Caribbean Club in the 20s. And there was quite a bit of West Indian students who had come. There were also, I mean, there were students from Europe. There were students. It was a very diverse class, and of course, all the faculty members at the time, they were primarily white physicians. I write about Alexander T. Augusta, and we know he's got the Fort Belvoir Medical Center now named after him, but he's the highest ranking Black soldier in the Civil War. He runs Contraband Hospital at Contraband Camp, which becomes Freedmen's Hospital. He's the first Black hospital administrator in the country. General Howard then sends him off to run a Freedmen's Bureau hospital in Savannah, and then he comes back and he gets on faculty, but he's a unicorn. There's a long period of time, decades, before they really have Black faculty coming in and training these physicians, but not because they don't exist. America's first Black physician, James McCoon Smith, has to go to Scotland to be trained. I tried to ask if there's one thing I regret not maybe getting a chance to dig into more. It's really trying to figure out the numbers here. I asked the archivist in Scotland because to be honest with you, I ran out of money and couldn't travel there. I traveled to most of the places that you read about in the book to touch and feel. I ran out of money and could not make the Scotland trip, but they digitized my great-grandfather's transcript for me.
Okay.
And that's how I found out where he lived, the street. And I could Google Earth map this thing and see the cobblestone street that he lived on, the unit he lived in, what grades he made. I could see all his test scores. But the value in that is I could see who he trained under at Howard. And then I could build narrative around those folks. Howard University didn't even have those records available. Like, why would they? But they're sitting in Scotland. And I asked, well, how many Black, either by way of the Caribbean, the UK, Canada, where were these Black African students? How many did you have? And she said, she didn't have a record for this, but she said, I can tell you not that many. That we had more Eastern Indian students who during this time period who came of students of color who were here, not so many Black students of the diaspora. And it was really a special thing. I think he left because the American Medical Association at the time has licensure requirements in place that require this residency at hospitals that are equipped a certain way, right? There aren't that many Black hospitals that can meet the standard that the AMA is calling for this licensure. This is important because the rules are applying to licensure mostly in southern states. Well, that's where your concentration, your Black population is, right? So it's kind of like they're practicing in Black hospitals, they're practicing in home care, they're fighting to desegregate hospitals. But as I like to say, and I found this little snippet in the Schomburg Center when I was researching, you kind of had the Howards and the Harvards and the Howards fighting for the same 6 spots at Freedmen's Hospital a year, and maybe at Providence. And, there were some key Black hospitals in Chicago, Nashville. Harlem Hospital wasn't desegregated. He's there while they're trying to desegregate Harlem Hospital. The Harlem Hospital is for Black folks, and the Black doctors can't practice there. I'll also add, I'm right in the Atlanta University Center. Spelman College has a student health center today, McVicker Hall. It used to be a public hospital. They are known for training Black nurses. And I go in and find they banned Black doctors at Spelman College. The leadership, Black institution doesn't equate to, being void of anti-Blackness. And so all these things in place, and see, my great-grandmother, he marries a woman from Maryland. And so he has an intent for naturalization, and it looks like he plans to stay here, but he throws up his hands, and by 1927, he's off to Scotland. It's just amazing to see. We don't talk about the Black experience in a global sense as much. And that goes for Black American and immigrants. But they're constantly looking for a place. You've got to remember, when he comes out of the war in 1919, McGill University and another university in Canada have a ban on Black medical students. They've got white women who sit on the trustee board of hospitals where they're doing their residencies, their internships, and they don't want Black attendants by their side in the maternity ward. So you can't finish your degree. McGill is calling down, and all of this is recorded in government records in Jamaica because they're having a fight about it on the island. They're like, we're sending our best and our brightest to Canada, and what is happening to them when they get there? And so they're calling to New York, they're calling down to Freedmen's, they're looking for places for Black students in Canada who can't finish the degree or be licensed. So everybody's fighting for the same few spots. That's the point I'm making. It makes sense that you would cross borders to figure out how to get in where you fit in, but we don't really explore the Black experience as much. I think in a mainstream way. There are plenty of brilliant scholars and folks who study their genealogy who know this, but we really kind of compartmentalize the Black experience in a way that's not true to what it has always been. I like everybody who's all about the idea of expat living. I'm like, honey, you should see when they passed the Fugitive Slave Act and Marianne Jack Carey and her family's like, look, I don't think this thing called America is going to work for us. I'm going to give you a guide. So I'm going to go up here to Canada and I'm going to create this newspaper and we're going to have our little underground railroad path to spread the news. And this is where you can go and have a better chance at surviving. The Black experience is a global experience. And I wish we would speak of it in that sense a little more.
Gosh, I am so glad that you did that in your book research and that you just said all of that, because I 100% agree with you. I'm studying right now the connections between Ida B. Wells and the Dreyfus Affair. And
oh,
yes, yeah.
Right. You have to come into my history of the Black press class. Let me make my note. She's going on the syllabus.
Yeah, it's just as I like to say, it's all hidden in plain sight. And that's what your book is doing. It's taking these archives that have been there, these yearbooks that just needed to be digitized, that these stories have been there. These people lived their lives. They did the things they were doing, but they've been hidden in plain sight. And it takes someone to go and ask those questions and go into the archives to really pull those stories out. So I love that you've broken that out in the book. And I was also wondering if you could tell us about is there a story, an archival story that you really enjoyed or found to be interesting or insightful that you want to share? Because there are several in the book. I really enjoyed the story about Shaw University, but you can share any of them. And as you're thinking about that, I see that people are writing questions in the chat.
Okay.
Good, following directions. Please don't forget, type your questions out now so that we can make sure that we have robust discussion. Okay, back to you.
Yes. No, I'm glad you started with Shaw, and if I may, I'm going to drop a link into the chat. My old television station aired a story a couple of days ago. We went and walked around Leonard Medical School for the story. So I'm just going to drop this in the chat there. And so Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, is home to America's first 4-year medical school. And I remember saying this years ago, and I had an editor, and I wasn't working on the story for ProPublica, but I was over at ProPublica. I was just, you find out these things, you can't stop talking about it. You can't stop thinking about it. And he asked me, he said, you mean the first 4-year Black medical school? I was like, oh, no. And so chapter 1 is entitled The Medical Education of the Negro Sets the Standard. Shaw University, when Henry Tupper and his wife, Sarah, land in Raleigh, after his service, he's a Union chaplain, and he gets this mission from the American Home Mission to, start these schools. So many of our schools are the Morehouse Spelman. They're coming from religious organizations. So the Baptists are behind Shaw, and he gets this assignment, and Henry Tupper has $500 in war savings that he can put toward building Shaw. And so Sarah Tupper is teaching Negro women domestic skills, and Henry Tupper is focused on preaching. So it's a preaching and teaching school. They obviously see, and I always say this, in the ashes of the Civil War, the great need for healthcare, for medical care. And so one of my favorite discoveries is, I go over to Shaw and I'm like, okay, put the archives in front of me. I want everything. And I'm on a reporting trip and I get there, I walk into the room, I'm psyched. This is like my first real archival search outside of my great grandfather. And they plop 3 boxes in front of me. And one's not even like a tall box. I have a picture of this somewhere. One's like a photo box. And then there are 2 boxes. And I'm like, where's the rest of it? And they're like, that's it. They said, well, UNC acquired some and Duke acquired some. And they start telling me kind of how the archives are scattered. So this is what we have. I'm like, okay. The photo box has a chemistry book from 1918, which is key because Shaw's Leonard ends up closing in 1918, which is smack dab in the middle of the Spanish flu pandemic. The other boxes have fascinating letters. Du Bois is very interested in this medical school lasting. I've been talking about this week. He believes his son could have been saved when he was at Atlanta University, had a Black doctor had the hospital privileges to a nearby hospital and been able to treat the toddler son who ends up dying. But anyway, I go through the stuff. I see where the Delaney sisters, and I'm seeing like names I recognize where everybody's fundraising to keep the medical school open. But I've got to put on my reporter hat because there's no way this is it. And I think I was trying to get over to UNC, and my Morehouse ID wouldn't give me privileges to the collection. I would have had to get a researcher. I'm like, where would the archives be? And so I'm like, who has personal papers? So personal papers for the second president of Shaw University. They're sitting in Atlanta at the Home Mission Society office on the satellite campus of Mercer University, which is the first university to integrate in the state of Georgia. So the Baptists have something on the second president. They don't have professional archivists, so the labels don't indicate there's a whole lot about Leonard. It's just like there are a couple of labels. I go check it out anyway. To wrap the story up, I find an unpublished history, a book that has not been published on the history of Shaw University that Meserve delivered to the Baptists in the 30s. Someone had brought this paperwork, this archive, right before COVID, and it went in a closet. And when they brought it out, they said, and then they sorted through it when we got back in person or whatever and labeled it the way they did. When I went through it, I find the founding documents for the med school. And you read it in the book, Henry Tupper's plea to the Baptists to consider this. They're not quite on board with it. This seems like really radical. It should be pointed out that at the time, Shaw was also proposing a law school. And when we think of Black law schools in North Carolina and the South, you're really thinking about North Carolina Central. But soon after the Civil War, they're thinking about a law school, and that's really radical. Because you want the Negro to defend himself in the courtroom while all of these laws are being formed. That's kind of off the table. They have renderings for it. He knows how he wants to build it. If you go to the attic of Shaw University's archives right now, there's a 3D rendering of the idea for the law school, along with the medical school. It's all upstairs. Somebody brought this to life decades ago, and it's sitting in the attic. But anyway, the medical school, he's like, I think I can get good-willed people. You have to read through the whole thing. I should have marked the page here, but it's a fascinating letter. And at the end, he's basically saying, and if this seems like a little too much, like, aren't we all brethren? Like Christian brothers, can't you just believe in this? So they get in the meeting and the trustees are like, well, if you're going to begin to put the Negro in a white coat, make him go to school longer. He ought not be given any favors. He ought to prove himself as intellectual as the white man. We will give them no favors. And that's literally how this starts. This idea that if I am to convince people to buy into medical education on scale, because you all have to remember, Leonard is producing more Black physicians in the Southeast than Meharry is at the time. Meharry is not as expansive as it is in the decades to come. Howard is a unicorn because you have congressional appropriations. Nobody's really touching General Howard's deal in DC. So then you got Meharry, and you have other Black colleges. They're up medical schools. They're shut down by the Flexner Report, 1910. I talk about that in the book and in that story from ABC 11. And Johns Hopkins is just considering 4-year curriculum. Standard education is 2-year apprenticeship, 3 years with the Ivy Leagues. So Johns Hopkins, Yale, Harvard, those are solid 3-year programs. But as Johns Hopkins is considering this move to 4 years, that's called innovation. When Shaw is being made to do it, it is called merit and improve yourself as intellectual as the white man. And they do. Virginia's first physician to pass the board exams with a perfect score is a Leonard Medical School grad. A perfect score of any race, it's a Leonard grad. Raleigh, North Carolina's first Black mayoral candidate who looks like he's got a shot at winning, W.T. Pope. That's how Raleigh, North Carolina gets voter disenfranchisement laws. They run insurance companies. They own printing press for the Black papers. They are ambassadors to other nations. They are, for all intents and purposes, like the threat, the problem with the Negro in the white coat is the political force he or she becomes. That's the problem. It's not rendering care, because you need the care rendered because you need a labor force. When people are really on board with this idea of Black physicians, they should have some to take care of their own. And even Flexner is saying, you don't want them to spread disease to white folks. And you want them healthy so they can labor, which is also a story behind the first public hospital in the United States for Black people, which is in Savannah. And I always say Georgia tells a very romantic story about the beginnings, but really the way that they convince folks to buy in and the state to buy into this is they say, look, if you build this hospital, enslavers, you don't have to keep sick property on your property. It really becomes an insurance policy for the enslaver. So if you think about hospital distrust today, if my choice is to go to the hospital and be nursed back to health so I can return to the plantation, that's a return to one death. And if you cannot nurse me back, then I stay in the hospital and I actually die. So the hospital to Black people in the first public hospital really represents death, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece of context to provide with understanding the broader history of healthcare, the importance of historically Black colleges in that story, but also, I'm still, thinking about what you said about Du Bois's son dying and him saying that he thinks he would have lived had he had a Black doctor attending him, because that's, as we've discussed, part of my family's personal story as well.
Yes. Yes.
My grandmother died at the age of 46 in the mid 60s because type 1 diabetes ran through my family. And she had gangrene in her foot and did not want to be treated at a colored hospital. So she let the infection get too bad until it was deadly. And as a
Mm.
result, the ripple effects of that, my mother being orphaned and then her having to, raise herself and then raise a family herself without parents, me not having grandparents. There are so many generational effects for something that was treatable. But as you said, for people who are living this very difficult segregated life, you think,
Yes.
okay, do I want to suffer the indignity of going into a colored hospital and in my illness be mistreated? Or do I want to go back to my regular life in segregated Alabama, work in domestic service, be insulted on a regular basis, have to get
Mhm,
off the
mhm,
sidewalk and use separate facilities. These
mhm.
are impossible choices that I think, shouldn't never have been allowed in the United States, but really define who we are and who we were as a country.
Well, and I'm glad that you point, back to this idea of dignity. I don't want people to get it twisted that the Black physicians weren't capable. The Colored Hospital didn't have the resources. When we speak of integration, this idea of moving toward integration is not to have kumbaya with another group of people. It's just not. It is largely to say, I am human, I am a man, I am a woman, I deserve agency, I deserve to be able to access the things that one needs to survive. And if that access, if the new school book is in your school, then I should be able to walk through that door and get the new school book. If the proper equipment is in your hospital, and I want my physician to have hospital privileges, the physician I trust to be able to go into that facility and access that equipment and care for me, I ought to have that. And I shouldn't have to enter through the back door or be in the drafty basement where I can go and catch pneumonia on top of whatever else I have, where you have mold and this. I am human. And so I think the way that we teach about the fight to integrate, to desegregate is all wrong as well. These folks are functioning very well. We are functioning very well out until there's violence to destroy what is being built. The problem is not being able to access it. I had an editor say, well, why was the admittance to the American Medical Association, why was the membership important if they went ahead and made the NMA, the National Medical Association? Okay, well, the AMA was globally helping to set policy. So if you have questions today about the lack of Black patients in clinical trials, I mean, you could point right back to policy. If you're not looking at a study and really taking that thing seriously, or if we're not appearing in the journals that are being used to train the physicians, Black or white, wherever they're in school. I mean, you read about the Alabama doctor in the late 19th century who speaks of the problem of the negress. He's a renowned physician in Alabama, and he talks about how the negress is my most problematic patient. And you know why? She exaggerates her pain. In childbirth, she's wailing and hooping and hollering. There's a lot of reference to hooping and hollering. She's the elder negress believes there's some sort of nutrition in the afterbirth and they want to consume it. And I was just saying this in DC the other night. I'm like, well, who's putting afterbirth in their milkshakes today? Like in your power shakes. And I'm surprised that she doesn't have more instances of cervical cancer because she's so promiscuous and she uses her organs in this way that I'm not sure what. And all of this gets put into the New York Medical Journal, which your Harvards and your Yales and your whatever. So all your race science, all your stupid stuff that's still being stripped from textbooks today. This idea about Black people and the bit of pain they can feel. And somebody pointed out, we have Black physicians who have subscribed to that. Yeah, they've subscribed to propaganda they've been taught. You got to strip that stuff out of it. It's just not true. There's nothing to back that. And so I think, and this often happens, Lenitra, you're going to have to pull me back because I just went around the world in 180 days. But yeah, it's all problematic. I don't know what the question was.
Yeah, you answered so many questions that I didn't even get to ask yet, which was great. because I really want to dig into the point that you made about that the issue with colored hospitals was not the qualifications of the Black doctors. And this is a systemic thing, that there's an assumption that Black people are inherently inferior when they have to do twice, three times, four times the amount of work to get half as much. And so these doctors are, as you say, they are leaders in their community. They are, they found businesses, they practice medicine. You know, they are more than qualified to be medical doctors. The first person to get a perfect score, as you mentioned on the exam, was a Black person.
Right.
It's the policies and the procedures that make it difficult to deliver the equal health care. So that leads me to ask you about someone who was very influential in the disappearance of Black medical schools, which
Oh, Abraham.
Abraham Flexner. Tell us about Abraham Flexner.
Well, you'll hear in that story out of Raleigh, I say he's quite underwhelming. He's wholly unqualified for the job he's been given from or commissioned to do from the American Medical Association in Carnegie. And Flexner is well connected. Flexner is a different kind of guy, maybe a RFK of education at the time. He's got these ideas. And if you listen to parts of the idea, maybe you could get on board if you didn't hear what was said right after it. Like, maybe, you know, people are trying to, Flexner's kind of out there. Flexner's out there. And he even has some trouble finishing some of his own graduate coursework, but he's friends with the president of Vanderbilt University, and he's been charged with giving this. Oh, and he's complimented Carnegie's leader in his writings, and they like the guy. They say, okay, you're going to evaluate all the North American medical schools, and this is important because I mentioned Canada earlier. So I'm going to tuck that away really quickly. But Flexner comes up with all the criteria. They're traveling, they're evaluating the med schools for faculty, equipment. That doesn't sound too controversial, right? But in context with how these places were built and what was available to them, there were just, the Black schools did not stand a chance in meeting this criterion in the early 20th century, in these full decades post-enslavement. It just wasn't happening. And one of the things I point out is like this idea of having a $600,000 endowment. We don't have endowments today. And the endowments that a lot of these universities, legacy universities have, they've been endowed off of land wealth and, dare I say it, the labor of the enslaved. I mean, one book I love is Rachel Swarn's 272 about the Catholics and GW and you know, the way that the university is built. When you start looking at where the wealth comes from to build the place, Stanford is another good example. You set criteria that it can't even be applicable to the institution, and you lose points for not meeting the criteria. So you're out of there. Leonard was out of there. And one thing I like that I found in the archives was kind of the way they were preparing for the follow-up visit, you know, from Flexner's assistant. And they didn't shut down right away. The report is in 1910 and Leonard closes by 1918. And by then they've trained 400 Black physicians, men and women. And what's left is Howard and Meharry. In Canada, you can see after the ban on the Black medical school students that their Flexner rating, their report rating goes up. I think they have like a C-, get up to a B+. And I'm not seeing what other improvements they made except they got rid of Black people. so you fast forward to the COVID pandemic, and I'm reporting, and we get a press release from the AMA. They're apologizing for the role they played in shutting down the medical schools because we're recognizing the distrust factor and representation in medicine. And the AMA over the years has made different apologies. One was made in Atlanta. I think I write about that in the early 2000s, and for their exclusionary policies, because the way the AMA was kind of washing their hands of racism was they were really going with what I call a states' rights argument. They're like, look, we're actually not keeping you out of the AMA, but if you can't belong to your state or local chapters, like you can't have membership. And I don't know what to say about that. And most of your Black physicians were in these southern states. And there was plenty of racism to go around in Chicago and New York. And those folks were just migrating from the South. And so if you couldn't get in locally, you ain't got AMA membership. And then a few people would get in here or there, and they'd say, see, we've got you coloreds. Like, what are you complaining about? But really, you're enacting policy that allows the exclusion and trying to wash your hands of being the villain. But Flexner does this. He shuts all these schools down. Howard and Meharry is left, and then we fast forward to 2020, and the AMA is like, look, this is the reason we don't have any of you all, because people need to remember the 5% or so Black physicians we do have today, the majority of them are still trained at historically Black colleges. Mm. Mm. So I don't know how far we want to go in this. I have been talking about it in the talks. What you hear from the DOJ today, and with the repeal of affirmative action and the challenges against scholarships and endowments, and what's about to happen with the big, beautiful bill, given the racial wealth gap and all of these things, it is what is in this book by another name. If you can't understand the context of the demise and the generational damage that is done from these policies, you really will not recognize how we're not going to recover from the current moment. My grandchildren will, maybe they'll write the thing, maybe they'll update an edition of this. Maybe I'll have a writer, a descendant, whatever, who will update this and then add what is being done today. And then maybe they'll be facing the same fight. We're in big trouble. We're in big, big trouble. And I've already encouraged my own children to start looking overseas for, I don't know if we'll be here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what I love about the way you tell this story is you this deep archival research that a lot of professors do but don't talk about, but it's so interesting. And the devil is in the details, literally. So
yeah,
all of the seeds of everything from racial segregation to enshrining inequality to promoting racial violence. That's not just one person deciding to burn a cross in someone's front lawn.
Oh, no.
Hundreds of different little policies, like what you described the AMA was doing. It's these little tiny policies and memos and ways that add up to a whole system of segregation that then perpetuates itself from generation to generation.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to remind our audience we're coming almost at the end of our conversation, so we want to move to Q&A soon. So please write your questions in the Q&A. But you've brought us to the present moment, and I think that there's just so many issues in the present moment about racial inequality, but in particular medical inequality. I'm thinking about the racial disparities in Black maternal mortality, how difficult it is, no matter what your level of education, if you're a Black woman giving birth, the chances of dying in childbirth are significantly higher. How are we currently affected today by there being so few Black doctors?
Well, it's the trust factor. and this is not to say that every Black doctor we encounter is going to be the doctor for us, but it is to say understanding the ways that trauma lives in the body. I mean, there's science behind this. We are very much built differently due to trauma. That the body, as the saying goes, keeps the score, it keeps the count. And so when you're talking about diabetes and it getting to that point in your lineage, what are the factors that play into that? Why do we treat things a certain way rather than look for a way to address it? I'm trying to think of when this story was published. I think ProPublica had a great investigation about how many more Black people are referred for amputation before they are given the advice or the care plan to rectify what is wrong in the body before you take the limb. Some bit of history and cultural competency is necessary to even think outside of the box and say, well, this is a done deal. You just need to do that. I was listening to a physician. I'm not a TikToker, but somehow this ended up on my IG feed. She was talking about unconscious bias that she didn't know she carried. She was in residency and an older Black woman came in with some back issues and she was dressed up, looked like she was going to church. She was dressed up and the physician said, well, you can't be in too much pain because you're walking around in these heels. Well, what we're taught is to show up in the best that you have because maybe your chances of being treated. And this is true. I know this even as I'm 42. So I know that you don't go to the doctor looking any kind of way. Because maybe upon seeing you, you'll be rendered you'll be deserving of a certain type of welcome, trust, that somebody will listen to you if you show up a certain way. Let me go ahead and do my hair up like this. Let me go ahead and wear this so they know that I'm about something. And that's all the woman was doing, showing up in the best she had, even if that meant she was aggravated and pain, but that's not the way to approach her. And so those are things. Health is a whole. I mean, we can talk about labs, we can talk about treatment, but as I find from, and I just love that I was able to find people who had been patients of my great grandfather when they were children, and he was on his way to the other side of this journey, and now they are 90 and above. So let me detour here, and I'll stop doing this. I tend to do this. But if I can touch someone that an ancestor has touched, then I'm not too far removed from the person or the condition. And one thing that they talked about was his bedside manner and what it meant to be seen in that way and be spoken to in that way. All of these things factor into our care and us determining whether we go back and get the treatment. The book opens up in rural Georgia, where there hasn't been a functioning county hospital for 2 decades. But as I find in the research, a century ago, there was a Black hospital, and it was located a quarter mile from where the people you meet in the prologue, from where they live now. It's called the Negro Log Cabin Community. And you'll find that one of the characters, she had some horrible effects from brain aneurysm, stroke, and her husband. There was no ambulance service out there, and her husband had to drive her an hour and a half to Augusta, Georgia, to get the treatment. And had she been able to be stabilized in the county and treated sooner, perhaps these effects would not have rendered themselves the way they did, which you can physically see the evidence on her today. She just couldn't get to the thing. And she had missed the care that she needed leading up to the stroke. It's a combination of things. You'll also meet a doctor named Patrice Body, who is like third generation Meharry. She's practicing out of the home hospitals that her grandfather, uncle, and father practiced out of. Some of their equipment is still in the basement of that home. They delivered all the Black babies in Milledgeville, Georgia, on what was referred to as Nigger Street. And even the barber, who's about 60 years old, was delivered by a body. That's their last name, by a Dr. Body, and can recall what it meant to be, they weren't born in hospitals, recall what it meant to be cared for in that home care setting. Because Dr. Patrice Body's in her early 70s, maybe mid 70s. Mm-hmm. And she's still working. She was running the vaccine clinic. She was doing everything. She can only do so much. She can stabilize. She's an internist. She can stabilize you. She can refer you. She can do all these things. She tries to get the ambulance there. Dr. Body sleeps in her office sometimes. She's the only Black physician in the area where there used to be many, and there used to be facilities. But everybody comes in and they come to the offices, one of two, without an appointment. I sat in her waiting room one day. Everybody wants to see Dr. Body.
And there she is, finding a way.
And there she is, finding a way, whether you can pay for it or not. Now, we know Medicaid expansion, and that this is a whole different conversation in the same vein. But they can't even afford the care for the referral. So you end up living and breathing this thing, and she has no plans of leaving. And that's what I find with many of the doctors in the text, they drop dead of heart attacks. I mean, my great-grandfather had a heart problem. When you are everything to everyone, because you don't exist in numbers, and you take in all of that, and you're fighting the civil rights fight. I mean, he served on the school board. You're going to find people who served on the school boards. Dr. Hubert Eaton, whose hospital desegregation case out of Wilmington, North Carolina, lasted 10 years. And when you get to the end of that, when you get out of Eaton's story and find out how he still did not get his hospital privilege, and the thing they came up with for him and not the other Black doctors in the suit, and it didn't matter because one of the other Black doctors in the suit dropped dead as soon as they won it. Mm-hmm. And he was desegregating New Hanover County schools, the YMCA. He was training Althea Gibson on a tennis court that he built in his backyard. They adopted her and trained her. I mean, so again, I've gone around the world. I think and whatever I said is in the vein of it answered some part of the question.
and we're better for it, because what you're saying is so profound. And what I want people in the audience to understand is that this is a very real phenomenon that Nicole is talking about. And it has a name. It's called John Henryism.
Yes.
The idea that you overexert yourself and thinking that you can beat a system, and you overwork to the point of death in a lot of cases. And you see John Henryism in academia, university presidents, faculty having heart attacks and strokes, all the doctors that you mentioned, many community leaders who are doing all of these different things. That's another unspoken but important toll that I think speaks to the title of your book, is the price of exclusion, that people are paying with their lives to be all things to all people. That itself is a form of racism and white supremacy. So I want to. Those are all the questions that I have. I want to make sure that we have time to get to the questions. And I think people have followed directions and put questions in the chat. So I'm going to bring Madison, our amazing assistant, to the Zoom, because she is going to be reading some of these questions.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for such a fantastic discussion. So much to just, oh my gosh, so interesting. I'm going to start with the questions first. We have about 6 questions, and then we have some general comments. And so I'm going to follow up with those after we do the questions specifically. From Judy, Dr. Levi Watkins was a Black cardiac surgeon who was the first person to implant an automatic defibrillator in a human patient. I read his obituary when he died about 10 years ago and wondered why I'd never heard of him. There seems to be very little that's written about him. Can you talk about him, and have you found that even very successful Black physicians don't get the recognition that white physicians do?
Absolutely. I cannot speak to Dr. Watkins because I didn't know about it. There's an author's note that I wanted to make very clear that this book didn't even begin to scratch the surface of what could have been written. This could have been a 600-page book. It could have been a 1,200-page book. And I also said you weren't going to find who I call the MLKs of medicine in the book. So we know quite a bit about Charles Drew. We know, I wanted to focus on lesser known physicians. And I found this greatness in the ancestor as well. Because to your point, you read this in an obituary, Judy, and you're wondering why you've never heard of them. Let me tell you who I found in my great-grandfather's class of 25. The only woman in the class had the patent on the period calendar. I think if the real contribution, if we had holistic, deep histories being taught, you could not subscribe to propaganda today. You could not believe some of what is happening politically. You could not reason with it if we were to learn these things as we should. I was again in Richmond yesterday, and Virginia Union had a hospital on campus, and so many of these Leonard graduates were responsible for building these hospital, systems around Richmond. This book could be written from any town, USA. You're going to find Black physicians in particular, and they had great relationships with lawyers, and then eventually the NAACP LDF to drive the federal cases. They're this socioeconomic engine. I mean, they're driving the policy, they're driving the change, they're gaining a little bit of wealth so they can finance these fights. And they're attacked in so many ways. The part about Dr. Eaton that I didn't include in the book was he was under investigation. The IRS was on his behind, showing up, raiding. His records were so meticulous, they couldn't find a pathway forward to stop him in that way through the IRS. The other, and I keep dropping links in the chat as well. There's a book that came out about a week or two before mine by Carlton Houston in Houston. It's called the Houston Negro Hospital. His grandfather is pivotal in starting that hospital, and he does the same kind of work I do. But his book, the whole book, is focused on Houston. So whereas this book takes you, around the world and through, I'm using my great-grandfather to take us through highlight these moments with lesser known figures. But we could do wherever you live today, go to an archive of a historic Black newspaper and put in quotations, Negro physician, Negro doctor, desegregation hospital, and you'll find the story in your backyard. You'll find the same story in this book in your backyard.
And before you ask the next question, I want to say that if there's a call to action from your book, that's what it is, Nicole. And I love that you are challenging people to do that research, because it is possible for anyone on this call or listening to look in their own backyard and find those histories that are hidden in plain sight. And it would be incumbent upon us as Black people who are shouldering so much to do all of the work to uncover these stories. Anyone can do this work, and everyone should do it. So thank you for that call to action. Okay, Madison.
Yeah. From Lillian, was there a dominant area of medicine that early Black doctors went into? Can you also talk more about Black people access to good medical care?
Oh, let me tell you. So they were a jack of all trades. So that's one thing I'm looking at, particularly with this transcript. And in the book, on the photo page, there's I don't know what you can see here, but there's a picture of the first page of the transcript, and it shows you what he was trained in at Howard. And so, and I talked to my great grandfather's patients too. He did everything from, he fell out with my grandfather when he would not perform a surgery to address a botched abortion that a young lady who sang in the church choir at the Anglican church in the parish, she had a botched abortion in Kingston, rode the train back and was bleeding, and went to the hospital. And you'll read about it in the book. They said you could hear her wailing. There was the stench of whatever. They said Dr. Ferguson could not touch her because of the laws at the time. He needed the parental, he needed permission to treat her. And the girl dies in the hospital. And my grandfather does not forgive him for that. So he's doing everything from addressing, and this is not just him on the island, because a lot of people are saying, why, how are you mixing this Caribbean thing with the Black American experience? It's really holistic. It's what you find across the board. One of his instructors, Dr. A.M. Curtis, he and his son owned a hospital in DuPont Circle that is now a multi-million-dollar condo complex with a historical marker that does not indicate it was a Black hospital. And it was the only place in the district where Black and white women could get abortions. And it looks exactly the same. Maybe if I lived in there, I wouldn't want to know what it used to be, but it looks exactly the same, and it's very expensive to live there. So he ran vaccination clinics. They stabilized for surgeries. He had a person who was a victim of a machete attack. So he's done amputations. So these early doctors, and this is medical care, period, up to a certain point. The specialty is surgery. That's what he goes to Scotland to learn, surgical procedures. And it is whatever you need to do to triage, treat, and move the patient forward. He's also as a DMO, so he's in private practice, and he's over the hospital as a district medical officer, a position that was typically given to British physicians who would move their family to the island, almost like military service, and they would get a certain amount of pay for housing and all the things, they were like serving for the government. Typically, the DMOs were white. It was rare to see him as a Black man overseeing the hospital in Port Antonio. He's in private practice. He is riding horseback to deliver basic supplies to areas of the parish that you cannot reach by roadway, which you probably still can't reach by roadway. A good roadway today. My grandmother used to talk about that. Dr. Ferguson would strap his bag on, ride by horseback. I mean, it's almost like it's stranger than fiction to me to imagine that you do all these things. But what I found, back to your question, is that they have to be holistic. They have to be trained in just about everything. And then the scientific discoveries, oh, this test doesn't work on melanin because of this. I'm going to challenge this and, try to get some kind of policy. When you read the NMA journal and the research that Black physicians were doing, and sometimes it translated to the AMA, depending on membership, but they're doing everything. They're doing everything. And was there a second part of the question? I'm sorry.
Yes, it was also, can you talk more about Black people access to good medical care?
What, in yesteryear or today?
It doesn't specify.
Well, I think to the point that Lenitra and I were making earlier, So if you had the access to the colored hospital, what did the colored hospital, what was it equipped with to enable your trusted physician to treat you? So they would find a way to build the hospital. The Eatons, when you get to the Wilmington chapter, it's important to put the Eaton family in the context of the 1898 insurrection, which is the only successful insurrection in the United States before January 6th. In Wilmington, God, in Wilmington, they overthrow a multiracial democracy. They go and I would like to set the record straight that the Atlanta Daily World is not the first Black daily newspaper in the United States, even though that's what the historical marker says right there in Atlanta. It is the first long-running daily newspaper, Black daily newspaper in the United States. Wilmington had a daily record. It was the first target in the insurrection because of an editorial that was written about from the editor who's the family was white passing, by the way. That's how they get out of town once they burn the newspaper down. But an editorial was written about how white men also sexually assault Black women, and it's never talked about. And there are all these claims against Black men. He's basically writing an Ida B. Wells-ish editorial, and they burn the daily newspaper down first. When they come from the ashes of that insurrection in 1898, and so many people leave. In fact, a grandson of a descendant of someone who fled Wilmington or was exiled from Wilmington in 1898 is almost 100 years old, and he's a Black physician in Atlanta who still lives in his house in Southwest Atlanta. Like, that's how close this stuff is. When one of the first things they have to build is a hospital for the people who survived and they stay there. Eaton's father-in-law, I believe, yes, is behind the planning for the Old Negro Hospital. It is in such ruin that they are fighting to get in James Walker Memorial Hospital, which is at the center of the federal desegregation case, because they just aren't equipped properly. They've got the physicians, but there's nothing they can do in that building anymore. And so the access, and they do open up home hospital care. They open up their own hospitals. They're still standing today. Dr. Eaton's old hospital in Wilmington on, is it 4th Street? It's somewhere right smack in the middle of downtown, is now Section 8 housing. Across the street is a museum preserved from the hospital he worked in with his father-in-law. But anyway, they have to build a whole hospital system out of the ashes of the insurrection. And it just gets to a point where they didn't have enough money to equip it properly. And so you might like your doctor, but that hospital sucked. And then white people were getting all the good care. They had physicians and, surgical lights and the tools and the things and federal funding, state funding, which is why the Hill-Burton Act is so important. What's happening today, we're reverse engineering the language of the civil rights movement and the policies behind federal funding, claiming without evidence racial discrimination, but using the framework that was used for these hospital desegregation cases and eventually the Civil Rights Act. And so access is not good because it's access to what? Half of the formula you need to survive. Mm-hmm.
From Abigail, congrats on your book. I've conducted some interviews with UK Black doctors and nurses and found out about persons at Edinburgh University, early 1900s. How did your grandfather earn money? Was it through private practice? I interviewed a Guyanese doctor who had to change his specialty due to racism, and had to change to general practice in Scotland.
Yeah, my great-grandfather lived in Edinburgh off 4th Street, which I hope to visit. And I'm glad you mentioned the Guyanese doctor because a faculty member at Morehouse who is sponsoring, we're going to go to Scotland during spring break. So I'm going to get to lay eyes on this. She said, my grandfather or my great-grandfather is Guyanese. He's right in the vein of the subjects that you speak of here. And he studied in Scotland and did, like, do you want to go? Absolutely. So I would like to know more about this. I have an idea. I do not know for sure about how he earned money, but before Scotland, he is practicing in Harlem. He's just not in Harlem Hospital. But there are plenty of Black hospitals. There are obviously the opportunity to do in-home care, to do house visits. And so he's got some money from practicing here for a couple of years. I know that much. He ascends to the highest rank possible in the British West Indies Regiment for colored troops. You could only be promoted to sergeant. That's as high as you could go. He does get that rank. He's not a part of the mutiny because he gets the medal when he comes out. So he's not dishonorably discharged, but he's likely signing off on a letter of all the Black sergeants who very eloquently say, run me my check, that you need to do this. I'm believing that he's got some kind of war savings, but not the land reparation. He ends up building his estate on United Fruit Company land. And when the family travels, they're on United Fruit Company ships. They're often on the ships. But I think that's because, remember I said he was DMO and he was in private practice. Port Antonio is like the hidden jewel in Jamaica. All of Hollywood loved Port Antonio. The Tiffany heirs have property in Port Antonio. Errol Flynn grew up there. Errol Flynn's father was the zoology instructor at Titchfield High School, where my grandmother and where one of the patients that you'll read about in the book, Dr. Basil Buchanan, he was the zoologist. And so I'd always heard growing up from one uncle that he was Errol Flynn's private physician too. So money, I mean, I know that's getting beyond the schooling, but I think he found ways through practice, perhaps through a bit of war savings, whatever he was pulling together, because they come from nothing in Trelawney. But I think that's how he's financing his work.
From Michael, do you view the future of Black medical care as requiring foreign training for doctors and others? Do you have recommendations on where to study?
I don't have recommendations on where to study, but I'm going to have to jump on it because my eldest daughter is 15, very interested in dermatology, very interested in a path through Spelman to maybe School of Med, but I want her to study abroad as well. I'm not sure. I have not delved into that. Do I see a future in it? Absolutely, because if we continue to defund the sciences here, we're no longer leading in anything. I don't know how we continue on the current path and expect that the best research work, we're all at risk for the current, by way of current policies. We are really, I live in the home, of course, of the CDC. If we now have to turn to medical associations, we're asking physicians and researchers to hold down the fort and give us the thing that we should trust independently through associations. Because if you tell me we're not requiring this vaccination anymore look at measles and everything else spreading everywhere. I got young kids in school. I need to stay on schedule. So I need my doctor to just tell me what really is. Because I can't necessarily turn to the CDC. I can no longer count on news media to deliver what we used to do. I mean, we used to live at the CDC. I'm sorry, that is my stomach. I'm sorry if you all heard this. We used to live, the distrust factor in the disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, because those are three different buckets here based on intentionality, is so high off the charts that yes, to your question, I do see us, we're out of the World Health Organization. we're trying to send people with certain conditions over to another country. We're cutting deals on where to send sick people. I need something better than what America has to offer right now. And I need it for our survival and for my own children and descendants, those who are yet to come. So yeah, I do see a future in that if we don't about face real quick and figure out how to repair what's been damaged over the last decade.
And I want to say, because I know we're almost out of time, to your last point, Nicole, and the audience member's question about study abroad. Students don't have to just go pursue medical education abroad. Just the act of taking students and having them study abroad at any point in their education is eye-opening and is proven to help improve their GPA, and proven to help make sure that they persist, proven to show that they develop critical thinking skills and creativity. So for our students across the board, I encourage my pre-med students in particular to study abroad as soon as possible, because it will shape the way that they see, literally the way they see and the way they think about the world. And
Lenitra, and empathy.
Empathy.
That's what we're missing.
Yes.
We need the humanities. We need to be concerned with the human condition, or we're all screwed.
The human condition. Yes. And Nicole, this has been just a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you for writing this book, for telling the story, for doing all of the archival work that you've done, for talking about the book, for all of the reporting that you've done. It really is something that is a sight to behold, but also a model for researchers, for students, for people in the community, and it really means a lot. And so thank you for having this conversation today. Thank you to Ollie for hosting. Thank you to Fall for the Book for all of their wonderful sponsorship of these types of talks. So please, I encourage everyone to get a copy of this book. Go to one of Nicole's in-person readings if you can, to meet her in person and get your book signed. I can't say enough about how fantastic this book is and how important it is. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this time. And